I'm going to be talking to Ryan Ness from the Canadian Institute for Climate Choices about a new study his organization has done about infrastructure in Canada. We don't have enough of it. Some of it's aging, needs to be upgraded. We need to adapt for climate crises like extreme heat and increasingly extreme rainfall. And we've got a big job ahead of us. So welcome to the interview, Ryan.
Thanks, glad to be here.
Well, look, why don't we start with an overview of the study, please?
Sure. Well, the most recent report that we put out called Underwater, the Cost of Climate Change for Canada's Infrastructure is an overview of the costs that climate change may have, both economic and otherwise, for the infrastructure that underpins life in this country. We look at some of the biggest potential costs that climate change may cause, as well as some of the opportunities that Canada has to adapt and avoid those costs through early action. And so we conclude that while infrastructure decisions aren't accounting for a warming climate right now in Canada, which could cost us billions of dollars, if governments take policy action now, we can save much of that heartache and cost that might otherwise come.
So where are the biggest infrastructure deficits?
Well, some of the biggest gaps in Canada's infrastructure around the condition of our public infrastructure, whether it's roads, telecommunication systems, or water and sewer systems. So not only is that a drag on our economic activity and productivity and growth, but it also means that there's inequities across the country in who has access to modern, up-to-date infrastructure. And as we know, it's often remote and Indigenous communities that have the biggest gap between themselves and the average person in Canada.
Now, I have a particular interest in electricity systems because we've done a lot of interviews with experts who talk, about the electrification of the Canadian economy, partly as part of the energy transition and partly as a response to climate policy. And, we've talked to a couple of modelers like Dr. Chris Bataille, who say that Canada will need 2 to 3 times as much power by 2050. And that means a big investment in the power grid, kind of like what we see the Americans doing south of the border. What role does the power grid play in your study?
Well, we actually focus specifically on electricity grids as part of our analysis. We look at the costs, the physical damage that a harsher climate, a hotter climate might bring about in terms of how that infrastructure degrades and comes to the end of its useful life more quickly under those conditions. And we found that it can cost billions of dollars annually just over the next couple of decades in additional costs to utilities and other owners of that infrastructure if nothing is done now to prepare. As you point out, electricity is going to become increasingly critical to Canada as an energy source as we move towards a low carbon or net zero economy. And we highlight in the report as well that this is both a risk and an opportunity. It's a risk if we build out that new electrical infrastructure required to support that transition in ways that are not resilient to a harsher and more volatile climate. We'll just be increasing our existing stock of infrastructure that is vulnerable to climate change. But on the flip side, it's a major opportunity as well. It's perhaps a once in a lifetime, once in a century opportunity to rethink the way that energy and other infrastructure works in this country. So while we're in there, while we're making these investments in decarbonizing our infrastructure, we should also be making investments in building its resilience.
One of the questions that come to mind, I was reading an article the other day about how the Americans are going to be burying some of their new transmission lines, because of the danger from wildfires. It's been a huge issue in California. And yes, it does add extra cost, but on the other hand, burning down parts of your economy and people's houses is a pretty big cost as well. So what about that, those sorts of mitigation measures? They cost a little more, but at the end of the day, they're a good investment for the future.
Building climate risks into long-term infrastructure planning decisions, whether it be the electrical or electricity grids or otherwise, will change the cost benefit proposition for some of those resilience investments that would otherwise be seen as not profitable or not offering a reasonable return. If you consider the consequences of not doing it and looking out at what the climate might otherwise do, we'll find, I think, that a lot of those investments make a lot more sense up front. We also look at, in our analysis, at some relatively straightforward adaptation interventions that can be performed on the grid, just upgrading components so that they withstand the hotter and perhaps wetter conditions 30, 40 years from now, that they won't experience right away, but they will experience before they get to the end of their useful life, will mean reduced chance of damage, reduced chance of outages, and long-term cost savings with relatively minimal upfront investment.
Now, who has to pay for all of this? I suppose we've got the federal government, we have provincial governments, we have private industry, we have consumers. How do those costs get distributed?
And I think you've highlighted the players, the parties that will be affected. To be sure, governments will have to lead the way through some investment, particularly when it comes to public infrastructure, infrastructure that they own and operate on behalf of people in Canada. But there's also a role to play for the private sector and private industry, whether it be real estate, whether it be utilities, whether it be other types of industries. Excuse me. And governments can also incent better behavior, as it were, on their part by requiring that they assess and disclose the climate risk associated with their operations. That will drive markets. It'll create price signals, whether it be through credit ratings, whether it be through stock prices, whether it be through the costs of accessing credit and capital. But it will send signals that cause those private sector actors to invest in making their infrastructure resilient and to make choices about the new infrastructure they will build that are more resilient, even if it means a little bit more investment up front. So price signals, markets are also an important complement to public sector investment.
Well, Ryan, thank you very much for this. Really appreciate your insights.
Thank you again for having me.